So just welcoming you back for this afternoon session. I'm Kelly Leringy from the Real Estate Foundation. I'm currently the chair of the Real Estate Foundation, though after yesterday's example with the photo with the head that was a chair, I wanted to come up with a new descriptor for my job title. So place chair here, and you'll remember me. I'm also a working residential realtor in Chilliwack. And for our board, we have 5 governors, and 3 of them are appointed from the real estate industry who really birthed the Real Estate Foundation 28 years ago. So that's my background. I'm feeling obviously then a little overwhelmed with, I said, I think there's more doctors in here than at the ER. I'm learning lots, making new friends, but I understand about half, so you understand that. As a philanthropic organization that helps advance sustainable land use, the Real Estate Foundation BC has a strong interest in novel approaches that support clean and adequate, or let's go for it, abundant water supply. This includes land use planning, policy, watershed governance, mapping studies, and applied research. Our grants go to nonprofit organizations working to improve BC communities through responsible and informed land use, conservation, and real estate practices. And as I've been sitting at tables, round tables, I don't think that we have yet sat at a round table where somebody at the group, in the group hasn't received some funding from the foundation over our last 25 years of granting. So it's really fun to see how things happen on the ground. It's a great education for me. It's really our pleasure to introduce this session on emerging ideas to support governance solutions that are community initiated and community driven. As a funder, the Real Estate Foundation is aware, very aware, of the expertise and the energy that resides in the nonprofit community, along with their passion to inspire great change. And again, I've been utterly inspired just by listening to all of the projects and ideas that have been coming out this week. So when we use this incredible resource and leverage it in partnership with that of the private sector, governments, and individual citizens, so i.e. the congregation, lasting change can happen. Change that supports the health and resilience of communities, ecosystems, and economies. In order for this to happen, we need to work together. This is the beauty of social finance. It's about making the most of our resources with positive social, environmental, and economic returns at all levels of the community through collaboration and innovation. And since my communications director is not here right now, I'm going to go off script right now for a moment, and no one's allowed to think on me who's traveling with us. Oh, that close, oh man. Okay, is that good? My CEO, Jack Wong, and I have to confess to skipping out for a short period this morning's sessions to go visit one of our past grantees, which is Couch and Green Communities, right down the street here in Duncan. And we've funded a number of projects for them over the years, and they were so excited to show us their new initiative. And I guess for those in Duncan, you're probably very familiar with what they've taken on, but it so fits into this theme that I had to share their purchase of this building they took on that had, a bar in it. It had 20 SOR units, which apparently were just a lovely hub of drug activity in the community, where people in the community didn't even want to walk on that side of the street past the building because it didn't feel safe. They purchased that building, and I have to say, with, she told us, very generous support and help from VanCity that believed in their project to take it on. They now have, using the pub kitchen as a community source kitchen for mental health training of people, of helping their young farmers sort and clean produce for the marketplace, and it's just started. And they renovated all 20 rooms, and they're beautiful. We took a tour of them. They're just lovely places for people to live, and they have 11 of the 20 rooms already rented and going, and it is really just a perfect example of a social purposing right. I mean, it's 2.5 blocks from here, and so It was a really exciting example to come across just this morning. So, back on script. For the Real Estate Foundation, what we do in addition to awarding grants, so our other functions are connecting organizations with common interests in the nonprofit and across sectors, and sharing results of the projects that our grantees have done. It gives us opportunities to help to extend or leverage the incredible value and expertise that the local community groups bring to the table on issues that are important to all of us. And of course, improving watershed governance is one of those things. The Real Estate Foundation is exceptionally pleased to be here, just as a group. There's 5 of us that have come to this forum because it's gathering people who are really in the know on various topics related to watershed governance, and as I've seen, have been really willing to listen to one another, share their ideas, and work on solutions to some really big challenges. We hope it's that this willingness, along with what we all, which means all of us, bring to the table, will help us to identify ways for we and our communities to invest our time, our energy, brain power, money, and other resources in new ways, strategic ways, and game-changing ways. And we're very, very privileged and happy to be part of the conversation. And again, another side note off script, I think it's extremely important for, if you're gonna have gatherings of these groups, we're here as a funder and as is Tides because we're a sponsor. But I think it'd be a really important place to invite funders who even aren't sponsors at the time, so they can hear your conversations and they can catch the fire of your energy and enthusiasm and see the impacts you're having. So just a note to extend the invitation to other funders and see if you can't help catch a little bit more fire and, you know, a little more money might flow. So now I'd like to introduce the people who will be leading this session. Our keynote is Mr. Gauthier. Ken is a professional engineer and the managing partner and principal of Urban Systems, where he has been since 2001, and they are based out of Kelowna, British Columbia. He is a social entrepreneur, which I'm hoping he's going to actually explain to me, and a community catalyst who's passionate about partnerships that bring about meaningful change in communities. In 2003, he was part of launching a new venture, Urban Matters, which is drawing on professional and community expertise to address some tough social and environmental issues, including how we deal with water. And I'm sure we're going to hear all about that. Then our first panelist, and I do apologize because we had a late change, did we? Okay, I'm looking for Paul Stewart.
That's me.
Oh, okay. Because I see 3 people and I only have prescriptions for 2. Paul Stewart, I'm told, is a rising star in community investment with VanCity, and he's going to have to tell you the rest because we couldn't meet up after the bathroom break for me to get more information. But I'm sure he has, as the previous person has, an overriding optimism about the real economy-focused and wealth-redefining good work going on and around VanCity. Our second panelist is Tim Morris. Tim is a consultant specializing in strategic and policy advice related to freshwater protection. And over the last decade, Tim has worked to protect Canada's lakes and rivers as an academic, an advocate, and a grant maker. He has a Master's of Law focused on water law and policy. He spent 5 years leading freshwater protection program at the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation. And he served on an advisory committee to the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, and also as a member of the board of the Canadian Environmental Grantmakers Network. He has been working on a number of initiatives with the Real Estate Foundation over just this past year. He's a great partner, really appreciate him, including the co-authoring of a report on the state of the water movement in British Columbia. So ladies and gentlemen, let us warmly welcome our speakers.
Thank you, Kelly, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the energetic 2:30 time slot. We'll try to keep this bubbly and active for you. I want to thank you all for welcoming me here and our panel here, and thank, of course, the Cowichan tribes for sharing their beautiful territory so generously with us over the last few days. I'm going to just walk through a whole bunch of different ideas around social finance. Some of my background that was described relates to some areas we're exploring within the context of our socially oriented business. But I've also had the opportunity to work with the province of British Columbia and the federal government now in exploring some different social finance tools and how they can be deployed. This ultimately might come across as I'm trying to describe this as a toolbox and to put some big ideas out there on the table. It might come across as a bit much. It might come across as a spilled toolbox by the time we're done. But the hope is I can start to familiarize and demystify some of this conversation, because I do think it does relate to how we start to explore building water governance entities in British Columbia. So let's dive in and make sure systems are working. Yes, so you got a quick introduction to our panelists, and I'll let them each tell you a little bit more about themselves when they step up. And I'm a bit of a context junkie here, so I'm just going to back up the truck for the first few slides and just maybe tell you a little bit about the story of social finance in Canada and British Columbia, what it all means, what it doesn't mean, and hopefully just take some of the jargon off the table. This is the kind of word cloud that is emerging in this space of social finance, social innovation, social enterprise, very high energy topics right now, high change topics permeating all levels of government, and we're seeing this all through communities. And the question I get asked the most often about all of this is, what does it all mean? So I'm going to share a couple of quick definitions, none of which are particularly good, but I want to just start with that as a table stakes entry point into what is social finance. And the Mars Center for Impact Investing is one of the leading institutions in the country, and this is their very simple definition, which probably doesn't help you much, an approach to managing money to solve social and environmental problems. And that's great. And so I kept searching and looking for a bit more depth and complexity in the definition that might, again, shine light, and I ended up getting a little bit more confused as I kept digging. So we go a little deeper into the description here. This is an organization called Social Innovation Generation that defines social finance. Sustainable approach to managing money that delivers social and environmental dividends and an economic return. All right, it's starting to get a little more interesting. I went out on a limb myself and came up with a simple definition for today, which is going to encompass everything that doesn't fall into a traditional government grant program or government-sponsored program can very easily, very, very easily, be called social finance at this point in time. So let's just go like that and say, all right, we're looking for new approaches to finance, some new ideas and some new agencies. I'm going to give a quick tip of the hat to some of the organizations that have really seeded this conversation in this country. And it'll be fairly quick, but I'll just, and I don't think they're represented here, but the McConnell Foundation is behind a lot of this conversation in the country. They're out of Montreal, I believe. And the story of the McConnell family, you can Google that. But they are behind that Mars Discovery District. They are behind the organization called Social Innovation Generation. They are behind socialfinance.ca. So most of the resources in this country are kind of anchored in the investment and the leadership and foresight of this organization. And they don't fund me, by the way. I'm just being a nice guy. Quick scan of some of the other resources online, and I offer these as much as interesting places you might choose to go when you're having a look around. I mentioned the Mars Discovery District, the Center for Impact Investing, and these are the areas of focus under their social finance banner. Probably doesn't mean much to you there, but Impact Aid is an incubator and accelerator for new businesses and new ventures. Community Finance Solutions kind of plays exactly into the space we're talking about today. The Social Venture Exchange is a new stock exchange concept that is built around socially and environmentally purposed businesses. Socialfinance.ca is the web resource, and I'll click on that one in a moment. B certification programs and finance incubators are just in their infancy. Come on. I mentioned socialfinance.ca, probably the leading resource online in the country. Have a quick scan. It's gotten into a bit of a storytelling genre of late, moving beyond the strict deployment of technical information, so it might be hard to find some very specific definitions, but there's lots of very interesting stories. I wanted as much as anything to point to the column in the green, which you can't really read, but it just lists all the different categories and the different things that fit under this umbrella of social finance. Give yourself another perspective on just how far-reaching this conversation can be. A couple of other quick notes in terms of where this is going at government level and resources I would point you to if interested. Harnessing the Power of Social Finance, put out by the Mars Center, but also supported by the federal government. Very interesting document, and mobilizing private capital for public good. So this is a movement. This is going on in Toronto, this is going on in Ottawa, this is going on across the country. It's also going on in Victoria, and I'll touch on that in a moment, but there are some fairly provocative documents here that are pointing to an interesting time of change in how infrastructure and services are financed. You can probably imagine some of the government's interest in this space. This was from the throne speech just last October, where it is now kind of getting line item status in how the politics of the day are starting to flow. This is work that has been done by your province in the last couple years. This is the BC Social Innovation Council, and I'm going to pause on this particular piece just for a moment. These are recommendations that were generated by community groups, motivated, inspired community groups about social change in the province. They were generated with the province in the room and have manifested or generated change. This is not anything that was regulated. It wasn't a task force. It was a volunteer committee that came together with government to develop some new approaches to break down those government systems that were inhibiting social change in the province. It makes me think a lot about the movement we are trying to start here today. A number of the recommendations that came out of this document were in the social finance category. Okay, working down the context line. So we've got movement in government, we've got recognition that we need to change the way we're doing things. We have a government, two levels of senior government, listening to some extent for new ideas and new approaches to solving problems. I'm going to start to try to marry this now into the conversation around water and water governance and early signs of legislation and interest that is pointing towards more autonomy, more independence in communities, different kinds of organizations being able to make decisions. I can't quite interpret exactly what is implied by these statements. They're weak enough at this point that it's tough to say, but there's something to work with in terms of how the government wants to see local community groups and organizations start to move into the space of managing water and watersheds. A nod to our recently released blueprint document that builds on that momentum and builds on it quite forcefully around the notion of building watershed governance entities. So what do we do with all this? What I tried to do now was start to bring this to this governance conversation and just explore some top-of-wave kind of ideas that might relate to watershed governance entities. To do that, I had to start to package some things up because there's so much in this space. And so I selected a few themes, a few buckets of activity, and I just wanted to share a few ideas in each before turning the microphone over. And we can have a dialogue after as to whether you've experienced any of these initiatives or ideas in practice, or whether it's something you might be interested in exploring. So the areas there are just the organizational framework, so some ideas in social finance around how you can organize agencies and entities differently. Some ideas in sustainable finance, which used to be called fundraising, but different concepts around how we can start to think about revenue streams to support our governance agencies, and then impact and measurement, which as we're starting to look at new social finance tools, we need to provide information to those who are investing in our organizations or our watershed entities that start to demonstrate there's value for the investment, almost at a return on investment kind of concept. So back to that first element, so the organizational framework, and I think I have a laser pointer here. So and here's well, I'll just The first point here relates to watershed governance agencies that may be legislated or brought about by an appointed process. And I'm going to pick on the Okanagan Basin Water Board because I know Anna, and she won't mind me doing that. That is one context for how watershed governance agencies might come to be. And there's been dialogue, you heard it just in the previous conversation here with Cowichan, around whether that is the right approach, whether that is an approach we can depend on. We need the province, we need the feds to change the system so we can create these agencies. That is one path. Even the Ontario model that was shared yesterday around conservation authorities, I'm not going to address that directly today. I can't really impact that or control that conversation. Obviously, if that could come to pass, that would be wonderful. If we could create 3,600 watershed agencies in the province that were financed through taxation or property taxes, or maybe through a reallocation of existing taxation resources, that's a great conversation. I think that needs to be explored and pushed. What I want to really touch on are the community-led or community-driven entities that I think a number of us represent here today, and might be the alternative path or something else we can be doing, perhaps while we're waiting for something from senior government. So across that axis, if that isn't abundantly clear, if it's not too visible in the back, are just a number of different organizational models around different kinds of organizations and how they can be classified, and they mean different things to the intent of the organization itself. But we've got everything from an operating charity on the far right to a pure commercial business enterprise on the far left, and there's a number of different operational models in between. And I'm going to touch on a few of them because I think it's worthwhile to, but it does introduce the concept of generating our own revenue, and that's where you start to use some of the indicators about what we're trying to achieve with our watershed entities in the realm of sustainable finance. Do we see ourselves engaging in revenue generating activities? We heard some of that in the Ontario Conservation Authority example. I think a number in 30 to 40% self-financing was mentioned in that conversation. And those are interesting. I don't know what the benchmarks are, watershed to watershed. We're going to have different conversations, but I think we need to be thinking about some component of self-revenue generation, and that will dictate some of these different business models that would be interesting to explore as you start to roll out some of these watershed entities. So, and that's largely the deciding factor in kind of which models we want to go with. What are we aiming to achieve? What are our goals? What kind of self-revenue generation examples or models do we expect to be into? Do we see ourselves getting into tourism? Could we be exploring ecosystem services that are provided by our watersheds, carbon credits, et cetera? So everything from I mentioned operating charity to a for-profit business, those are probably the outlying examples, but then what's called enterprising nonprofits and co-ops, socially purposed business ideas, on-mission enterprising arm of a charity. Not sure what to say about that one. And I'll just hit on a couple of them quickly here. One is an interesting model that plays out in a number of communities and might be interesting in a smaller watershed context around exploring a co-op, a cooperative model within which to incorporate or capture the intent and the spirit of a watershed entity. Other social enterprise ideas, and again, we can range from anywhere from 30 to 40% to 100% to 10% in terms of self-revenue generation, but we can build models that essentially create a blueprint for watershed entities that are based on a bit of a business headspace. And that's not to say grants and charities and participation from senior levels of government can be excluded, but there are some really neat ideas in here that I think need to start creeping into our conversations about these watershed entities. A social enterprise is essentially a nonprofit model in business. I'll try to explain it quickly here in the next couple of slides. Let me go ahead one. Typically, a for-profit business seeks, in many cases exclusively, a financial return on investment. A granting agency, such as the Real Estate Foundation of BC, seeking a predominantly social and environmental return on investment. And what we're starting to talk about are agencies and entities, including potential watershed entities, that could creep into a blended value return on investment kind of idea. This is such an interesting concept our province has led in Canada and enabled the first legislation for hybrid business incorporation called the Community Contribution Company, C3, and it aspires to occupy that space in between the two axes. And so we now have a legislative framework in British Columbia, and that was done on the backs of passionate volunteers to get that legislation pushed through in the last couple of years. There's about 12 of these agencies now incorporated in the province, and I'd like to introduce it to the conversation about watershed entities. I think it's an interesting play and an interesting piece that we can start to explore together. So that's kind of just a quick overview and a snapshot of some ideas in the space of how we might incorporate and the policy and legislation around some of these watershed agencies. Talk quickly about some financing ideas that might be a little out of left field. I just really want to separate here in numbers 1 and 2 the difference between what is ongoing supportive financing for these organizations and project-specific financing, and I think we're going to need to look at both. So we've heard a number of different, I'm assuming we've heard a little bit in the media around microloans, micro-lending, crowdsourced funding. These are all in this category of how we can start to explore financing some of our initiatives. Microlending is essentially using a web platform to allow dollars to flow to individuals outside, typically outside the traditional capital credit markets. And so I have a spare $500, I can put it up on the website, earn a percentage point by lending it to someone else in my community. And so there are a number of these platforms all over British Columbia. This is local. This is, I think, in Victoria, this particular example. But it just starts to be interesting and relative to how we might start to finance some of our projects. Similarly, crowdsource funding around if we have special initiatives through a watershed agency or entity, we can start to explore whether or not we might have a project that would qualify or would be interesting within the context of crowdsource funding for infrastructure. Cautionary note here, that this doesn't lend itself to every single kind of project. The projects that are tend to be appealing in a crowdsourced context may not be the pipe in the ground or the weir upgrade and tend to be more leaning towards a community park or a facility or an amenity for the public that wouldn't otherwise be assumed to be included in the taxes I'm already paying. And so we've seen some efforts to put a new water main in Main Street through a crowdsourced platform that have gone not terribly well. Impact investing, and this is now bringing investment dollars from open capital markets that have an interest in social and environmental return into our space. There's an example here called Resilient Capital, which is a fund that was established by our friends at VanCity that invests in socially and environmentally motivated companies to see a return on investment where I might be expecting a 10% return in a typical GIC investment or a mutual fund investment. I'm not sure where the 10% GIC came from. If you know of one, let me know. And so a pooling of these organizations can start to return 3, 4, 5, 6%, with 2 or 3 points of that being dedicated now to the social and the environmental benefit that is accrued by the companies that are within this kind of a fund. It's a really neat little example. So VanCity's out there doing this kind of thing, and this is in a general context, just out there supporting well-meaning organizations and companies. The model starts to evolve a little bit and open up to very specific areas. And I know there's another organization also spun out of VanCity called New Market Funds that is now funding very specifically projects that address homelessness in the downtown east side of Vancouver, projects that address substance abuse in the downtown east side of Vancouver, and they're producing both revenue and social and environmental returns on investment. There could very easily be a family of investment opportunities around water stewardship, around watershed governance, around watershed benefits, salmon stocks returning, et cetera, that creates pools of funds for all of us to tap into. Come on. That was a nice little breather. And another topic you'll hear a lot about is a social impact bond. And there aren't any real practical examples in Canada, but the diagram's not great. It'll look better up close, and I'll be happy to make a PDF of these slides available. There are a few examples of these, one in the States now, and there's a couple in the UK. The essential premise in what that diagram is attempting to replicate is if an agency can create an intervention in a broken system, and so if the provincial government is funding, I'm going to use a social example. Let's use an example, like a substance abuse example. Let's use the Insight facility in the downtown east side of Vancouver, where it's a safe injection site that wasn't set up as a social impact bond, by the way, but it could be. And so you have a system where you have known quantities. You have a system of humans and individuals, in this case, that are creating sets of costs on the system, on the taxpayer system. And we know what they are, and we can measure them. We can create, in theory, an intervention, and an agency could come in, like Insight, and suggest to the provincial government, we have a better way of dealing with this problem. And for a fraction of what you're currently spending of taxpayer dollars on solving this problem, we can create better outcomes and over a fixed period of time, and return an investment to the province. And so if the province was spending $1 million on a problem, we can go in with a new solution and return $500,000, do it cheaper and better. That creates a bond scenario where I, as an investor, can contribute to that. If the outcomes are predictable, I can get 5, 6, 7% on that. It's a little complicated, a little risky. The BC government is very pushy, though. They're very interested in exploring the concept of a social impact bond. So there's a lot of movement and a lot of opportunity to start to explore what that might look like. So I start to think of things like, we heard about some statistics in terms of drinking water quality in some Aboriginal communities across British Columbia, and there could be an intervention in that system where new solutions are put on the ground at a fraction of the cost, expedited quicker, open to investment in capital markets. We can solve the problem in 5 years. The federal government might take 20 or 30 on their current program. We can do it cheaper and return in a dividend to our investors. So again, not to get all techie-talky, but kind of ideas like that are out there and increasingly interesting to your senior governments for a whole bunch of reasons. And as we get into this space around investing, and so the idea of impact investing, everything I've kind of shared involves someone else or capital markets putting money into solutions that benefit the environment, that benefit social circumstances we're dealing with. It brings up the question of accountability and impact and measurement. And I'm just going to quickly, so the transparency in these models is heightened. We're now starting to use tools like, this is a methodology called social return on investment. There's a comparable methodology called environmental return on investment. And we can start to quantify the benefits of our actions. So when I think of a watershed agency and what it does, like Cowichan, or have we captured the value to society, to the province, to Canada, to the community in investor terms, and so it is quantifying and monetizing those benefits and those values. But we can do that now, and we have enough of a database of knowledge and global experiences where we can start to put a dollar value to the benefits that we're creating. We did a little quantification exercise for an agency that works in the downtown east side of Vancouver again, and we started to test out this methodology and started to generate numbers like, for every dollar you invest in this foundation that deals with substance abuse and homelessness in the downtown east side, society is receiving a $4 dividend. Doesn't seem like much, but in terms of the leverage that that conversation produces and the conversations that that foundation can now have with City Hall, can now have with its investors, it's a game changer. And so now you start to think of things like And they immediately went to property taxes and other things that they're paying to the city and started to use some of this math and some of this benefit calculation to maybe balance the playing field a little bit. Another quick example, this is going on globally. This is the New Economics Foundation in London, also leading in the conversation about calculating social and environmental return on investment. So I'm going to pause there, and what I want to wrap up with is again, that's the spilled toolbox of just a couple of quick ideas that are innovative and new and need a lot more dialogue and conversation to work in the watershed governance context. But they're plausible, and they're very, very interesting for everything I've heard in the last couple days. And I can see something like a social finance task force spilling out of the blueprint document that really starts to create a bit of a roadmap or something a bit more tangible for all of you. So, how did we decide we were going to do this? VanCity was going to say Brittney was going to say a few words next. Excellent. So Brittney is a watershed planning engineer. We're going to go with that. Working for our organization. She is planning to build a career in this space, maybe 5 or 6 years in at this point. She's lowering our average age up here, and we are wanting to get a broader kind of youth engagement conversation going. And I think she's adding to the otherwise middle-aged white dude syndrome up here too. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, for building my soapbox. And thank you, Couch and Tribes, for sharing this beautiful space with us, and to Oliver and Laura for this opportunity. The last time I was in front of such a large group, I think, was maybe grade 4, when I gave a speech about my dog Gilmore to my public school. And I remember it being a lot less scary at the age of 9. So luckily, though, yesterday Tessa set such a wonderful example for us. And I'm the ripe old age of 27, and at 22, you demonstrated such leadership. So thank you. It's really inspiring. I'm here to speak briefly about social finance and how youth can play a key role in bringing this to water governance. I'm sure that for many of you in this room, the concepts that Ken just introduced are new. The ideas are emerging very quickly. You might be wondering how they can help you. You might be uncomfortable with some of them. You might want that perfect example of, or to use as a model. And you might think that you need more expertise on the subject or more certainty. And to this I say welcome to my world as a young professional. My generation was born into this dynamic, fast-paced world. Until yesterday, I didn't know what stationarity meant. I didn't know that it was ever alive. And I see this as a really good thing. As Oliver mentioned yesterday, water governance needs to change more in the next 10 years than it has in the past 100. Old ways of thinking won't get us anywhere, and this includes the way that we finance the work that we do and the partnerships we establish to do so. Youth might not bring years of experience or gray hairs to the table, but we also don't bring fatigue. We don't bring any old relationship baggage with other partners, and we're definitely not yet jaded. So we're hopeful, we're optimistic. Most importantly, we're open to new possibilities. And with that, I'd like to share a few financing possibilities with you. On microfinance, you might want to consider how this could be used to finance more water-efficient technology for small farmers to work on your water conservation targets. This is a common idea that's being used in developing parts of the world, and I don't think we look there often enough for examples of what we can do here. Social impact bonds, maybe they can be used to, again, target water conservation, save your municipality on pumping and treatment costs. Or they could be applied here in the watershed to help make the shellfish harvest possible again. I'm really excited to see what we can do, and I'm calling on all of you to engage young leaders as you explore different opportunities. We really do have a lot more to lose than a lot of the old folks here if we don't get this right, and I believe that we can work together and we can learn from each other to affect this change. So please feel free to speak to me, to the other young people in this room, and definitely to the young folks back in your home waters about how we can work together. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paul. I work for VanCity Credit Union in Vancouver. The old story is dying. The old story is dying. The story I'm referring to is the same story that Ian Gill wrote about last week in the Tyee when he talked about Neil Young's tar sands tour in defense of the Athabasca Chipewyan Legal Defense Fund. There goes all my papers. He called it the colonial industrial complex. The colonial industrial complex is dying. The news story, it hasn't yet been codified. The news story is being written right now by activists and entrepreneurs, citizens, entrepreneurs, and banks and governments. If I was to take a guess at what the news story is about, I would say it's that we're not all separate beings. We're not all out for ourselves. We are in fact the same. We are connected. We are not separate from nature, we are nature. It is the reason we feel pain when we see another human or animal suffering from violence. It's the pain in our gut that we feel when we see a clear cut, or that when we find out that the coral around the world is being bleached. I believe we feel this way because we are the water, we are the land, that everything is in fact connected. VanCity Credit Union is writing a part of this news story through collaboration and experimentation in social finance. I have the privilege of working for a CEO named Tamara Vrooman. If you haven't met her, you must, because she tells gorgeous stories like the one I'm going to tell you right now. One day, she says she was driving her little boy to school. He's 5 years old, he's sitting in the back of the car, and he says, "Mom, what do you do?" And she says, "Son, I'm the CEO of a $18 billion financial institution." And there's this 5-year-old pause, right? You can just hear the gerbil running in his head, and his son says, "Mom, can little boys grow up to be CEOs?" She loves to tell stories like that. She also has a lot of vision, and when she came in, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I've only been there for 2.5, so I don't know how long she's been there, but it's only been a short time. And in that year when she showed up, VanCity gave away $25 million of profits to the community, to various community groups in the form of grants, etc. And she said, "Nah, that's not bad." And she said, "It took 2,500 people to hand out that $25 million. You divide $25 million by 2,500 people, that's all right." She said, "We've got $18 billion in assets. Why don't we put that $18 billion to good use instead of the $25 million? So I'm proud to say that myself, I work in a division called Community Business. I hand out loans and other things. Myself and everybody in my division, if not the entire organization, has impact targets, and that means that every account manager has to give out at least half of his loans and ensure that every one of those impacts community or the environment. I'm 100%, which means that 100% of what I do has to have a positive impact, and that's Tamara's doing. So how can we do this and the banks cannot? Well, there's a big difference between credit unions and the banks, and that is we're the shareholders. If you have a VanCity account, you're the shareholder, you're the owner. Bay Street doesn't tell us what to do. we have goals, but we don't have a return that we need to supply to these shareholders. We don't compete. We're competitive, but we don't compete. We collaborate, meaning somebody says to me, Royal Bank did this fantastic high-impact loan in my market territory, I say, fantastic. That's outstanding. I'm not competing with that. If I do a loan in Duncan, I call up the local credit union here first, and I say, hey, are you aware of this? Do you want in on it? What can we learn from each other? We don't compete. When I walked in to the hall here, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm rambling. When I walked into the hall here, I read the writing on the wall, and it said the Cowichan Valley the Cowichan values were embodied in the teachings that were passed down by personal example, storytelling, and strong understanding of the importance of respect, cooperation, and the necessity of being in harmony with natural environmental cycles. I think that VanCity and your local credit union are aligned with those values. And we're actively experimenting to codify this new story by collaborating, cooperating, and building partnerships. Let me talk very quickly about 2 areas that I can give examples of how we're innovating socially. One of them Ken mentioned was resilient capital, because keep in mind, and I hear this over and over and over again when our members and with customers of other banks complain that the banks aren't taking any risks. And the reason is that a Boy Scout troop comes into VanCity and they take the money that they've made from bake sales and selling apples and so forth, and they put it into an account. And that money, we got to give that money back to them so they can go to the Jamboree in August. But in the meantime, what I do is I take that money and I lend it out to you. And I got to get it back to the Boy Scouts, right? So that's the reason we can't take much risk. But at the same time, we understand that we're in a period of creating the new story, of experimenting with activists and entrepreneurs. And so to do that, we create things like resilient capital, which, as Ken mentioned, are term deposits that backstop certain transactions where we can take more risk. Another perfect example is a project I'm working on for VanCity called simply crowdfunding. I'm hoping that VanCity can start crowdfunding because they say in the 1800s, if you wanted money, you needed to be related to it. In the 1900s, if you wanted money, you had to be friends with it. Well, thank goodness in the millennium, you just have to be online. VanCity has about 500,000 members, which means about 1 in 5 people in Vancouver and on Island bank with us. And what I'm really hoping is that we can take a credit union like VanCity, who's really good at this, right? Traditionally being top-down, and really connecting them with the crowd. Because it's when the expertise of the community is linked in with the expertise of the financial institution that really cool stuff happens. So just to finish off, social finance is just finance that's gone social. It's collaborating, it's cooperating, it's partnerships. So if you have a project you're working on, I recommend, number 1, you call your local credit union. Or number 2, give me a call. We're interested in this collaboration. I've got an army of 2,500 people and $18 billion in my pocket. I can't promise anything, but we'll give it our best shot. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much. That was really eloquent. Really enjoyed that. It's a great panel to be part of. Actually, I was just really interested to learn about social finance, not something I have a ton of knowledge in. And so the reason I'm here is to provide a bit of context about the role of philanthropy and foundations. And Jerry Maguire isn't quite as eloquent as my previous panelists, but I think that's a lot of what people are thinking about when we're talking about setting up watershed governance entities. Show me the money. Before I start, I want to thank Cowichan Tribes for hosting us on their lands. I'm actually from Ontario. I come from the Georgian Bay watershed. As Kelly said, I've had a fair bit of experience with foundations, both as a grantee, also as a grant maker, and now as a consultant providing some advice and trying to support funders in different parts of the country work together to maximize their impact around water. So I was really taken by this idea of a new story, and it sort of struck me that another reason we kind of need to come up with a new story which relates to funding is that I think there's a fairly profound shift that's been happening in Canada around our kind of social contract with government. I think what's happened is we used to have a bit more of a European-style philosophy where we depended on government to fund a lot of our public services, a lot of the things we rely on as a society. And I think even before the markets crashed and a lot of governments around the world are now struggling, we started a shift. I think Roger Hunter calls it peak government. Started in 96, was it Roger? 96, peak government. And since that point, I think we've really been moving more towards perhaps an American-style philosophy around social contract, more of emphasis on individual rights, more emphasis on sort of the private sector solutions. And the other thing they have in the US is a stronger philanthropic sector as well, in part because of the different nature of social contract. So what I think as society is we haven't quite caught up to that fact, and we still depend or think the government should be funding a lot of these things which it isn't any longer funding. And so perhaps that's another reason to think of why we might need a kind of a new story or a new approach. In terms of how that relates to foundations, as I explained, in Canada we do have a developing sort of philanthropic sector. I think it actually, relatively speaking, is more developed than in Europe, in part because of that greater reliance on government. But it isn't anywhere near the size or maturity of US foundations. So as many of you are probably aware, when you talk to foundations, they really like to say we want to manage expectations. We can't fund everything, and we can't give everybody grants. And I think that it's really important to understand that it is a constrained amount of funding that's out there from the foundation world to be able to provide to different projects and programs happening out there. Let me get the slides to it. What I wanted to do is just provide a little bit of context on philanthropy and how much money is coming from philanthropy. Do I use it? Okay. That one? Okay. So how much funding goes to water from philanthropy? We actually don't have this information, so I'm kind of misleading a little bit. We do know that $8.5 billion from individual charitable donations are made every year, and 6% of this goes towards the environment. In terms of grants from foundations, we know that $4.3 billion comes from foundations, and 6% of funders report an interest in environment. And then 11% of grant dollars from the members of the Philanthropic Foundations of Canada goes towards the environment. It's $25 million. And that's not by any means all the foundations in Canada, but it starts to give you a sense of the proportion of funding that goes towards the environment. And then 12% of these grants made by community foundations, which is about $19.8 million, are allocated to the environment. And then if you look at grants by issue, so when it's going to the environment, there's all sorts of environmental issues that foundations fund or care about. About 8.2% is going towards water and freshwater ecosystem protection. So it's a relatively small amount of money. So we really have to think about how to use that strategically in the philanthropic world. I just want to kind of give you a sense that there's quite a range of different foundations out there. It's a real kind of mixed bag. There's private foundations, public foundations, community foundations, innovative foundations like the Real Estate Foundation. there's no one size fits all. It's a real suite. We'll move on from that slide. So before I touch on this slide, I wanted to just kind of explain what I think foundations are good at. So if there's a limited amount of funding out there, they're not necessarily going to fund all the activities of a watershed governance entity. I don't think they can provide sustained funding for long periods of time for watershed entities. I think there are three things that foundations are good at that relate to this whole idea of watershed governance. So a bit like Oliver, I like to think in threes, but even more recently, I've constrained it to 3 Ps. So one of the things is proof of concept. So one of the most important roles I think foundations can play is to fund pilot projects and getting some of this innovative thinking and approaches to a proof of concept to actually show that these things work. So front-end money that goes into a pilot project or a test to show that we can actually do watershed governance and prove that it can happen. Another area where I think it's really important for foundations to play a role is policy development. Increasingly, we're seeing that policy is being outsourced out of government, and I think foundations can play a role in supporting input to the policy process so that it can actually be useful and effective in supporting watershed governance. And then finally, I think public engagement is another critical area that foundations can play a role in supporting civil society groups to really create the conditions and the impetus for local communities to set up these watershed governance processes or entities. So those are the kind of 3 areas I think foundations really have a niche. So what I was thinking would be pretty interesting is if at some point we could bring kind of a bit of a brain trust of the different thinkers or doers in the space of finance or funding, and really think through kind of the continuum of what would help support watershed governance entities. So from a point of sort of catalytic, creating the enabling environment where I think foundations are really well placed to provide initial funding support because they can take more risk than say someone that's looking for a return on investment, to this kind of institutional design or build where I think you could have a mix of philanthropy, perhaps local, regional government. Maybe there's a role for social finance in kind of designing the institutions of watershed governance. And then to the planning phase, coming up with the watershed plans. And then to the point of kind of implementing, bringing those plans to life. And I really like the idea of this distinction between core support, kind of sustained funding for watershed entities and projects. And I think when you're thinking about sustainable funding, it might well be social finance has a role. I think local tax base, clearly we heard from the Okanagan Water Basin Board, that's an area that's supporting them. As well as I think we shouldn't completely take the pressure off government because there is a lot more they can do to get more money through water license fees. So I think what would be really interesting is to kind of come up with a team or some people to think through the different phases of developing watershed entities and where the funding for that can come from the mix of foundations, social finance. Obviously senior government needs to play some kind of a role to the local government and the tax base. And I think there's people in this room who, if had the opportunity, could come together and think through some of these problems creatively and get beyond the sort of old story, the idea that we should rely purely on government to fund these things, to something that I think is going to be more sustainable down the road. Thank you.